All right, so does anybody have anything in regards to what we talked about last, or yeah, what is today, Thursday? Today, Thursday? Yeah. Does anybody have anything we talked about in regards to natural law theory? Because that was the last ethical theory that we talked about. But
I just want to know how to steal the soul of what a desk is.
the soul of a desk?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's,
Learn how to extract its essence.
you don't learn to do it, you just do it, right? So, but it wouldn't be, but, well, the reason I'm engaging that is because what would your soul be? Natural law, or even abstraction. What would your soul be?
What your purpose is?
Well, no, that would be wrapped up in your nature or essence, right? But your soul would be what?
Delicious.
Yummy. Tastes like air. So what would your soul be on that in regards to those causes, so to speak? What would it be? Would a desk have a soul? Not necessarily, right? Because it's analogous. But, so say Aristotle would say that your soul, what we would call the soul, just is the formal cause, right? Just is the humanness or whatever. So in that sense, your soul just is the formal cause of the human being, which again is why you're not something else, right? Why you're not a rat or whatever, or a desk or something else. That your soul is what they would say is just the formal cause or the nature or essence of what makes you human. Just like the form or essence of a desk is what makes it a desk or a rabbit or whatever, just the form, the formal cause of that thing, right? Does that make sense? At least in the context of what we were talking about. Now, let's talk about some of the things that we talked about that we started to end with. And it just cut off abruptly. Stop. And essences of things or whatever. Law theory depend on it. Depends on what? And essences, right, to things. Does that make sense? Did you listen to that thing? Oh yeah, you'll be completely probably lost.
I'll listen to it tonight.
So if modern philosophy comes along, Enlightenment era philosophy comes along and denies the existence of natures and essences and all that kind of stuff, it should just go without saying that natural law theory would be flushed down the toilet, right? I mean, because that's what it depends upon, is your ability to abstract the nature and essence of things, right? And so as a result of that, it depends upon what? Natures and essences being what? Real, right? So when modern philosophy comes along and denies that they exist, then obviously, again, as we said, it should just go without saying that natural law theory would disappear because they're just not a nature and an essence. But what else does that entail if there are no such thing as natures and essences? Let's look at what that view is called very quickly. And remember, this view is currently has fallen on hard times. It would be the entailment of the no such thingness. Nominalism, right? That's the one of the prevailing views right now, right? Nominalism. Name, it means roughly in name only, that there's no such thing as essence to anything. So as we ended with, what does that mean? What would that entail? What would be some of the consequences of that if there is no such thing, essence to something? What about what we talked about the other day about reality being something that you discover? as opposed to something you invent? What would be the consequence of that? Or how would that relate to that? So a statement like that. You guys are so quiet. It's funny, listen to this. Aristotle supposedly at one time said that the only things that don't ask questions are basically animals and apes or the gods. He said animals and apes don't ask questions because they're too stupid to know how to ask questions, right? And of course, I'm paraphrasing there. And then he said, and the gods, quote unquote, wouldn't have to ask questions because they just already know everything, right? So apparently, supposedly, like when he was giving a talk to one of his students or a lecture or whatever, and nobody had any questions, he was like, all right, so you don't have any questions. So is it either because you're like the animals and apes and you're too stupid to ask questions, or is it because you're like the gods and you already know enough, right? So which one are you guys? So what's the entailment of that? If there's no such thing in nature as natures and essences, and what we talked about in regards to knowing or discovering or let's say it this way, discovering or inventing reality, how do those things go together? How do they coincide? How do those two ideas go with one another? How are they related? How are they related? If there's no nature and no essence to something, then what do you do? Well, or you just make up crap, right? Remember how we talked about how this directly entails? All right, think about this. Remember, if there's no nature or essence to a man, and here I mean, say, biologically speaking, a man. If there's no nature or essence to that, then what is that? What's the difference between this and this? What's the difference between those? If there's no nature or essence to the thing between them. And again, this is the position of what? Nominalism. That there's no such thing or essence to anything, right? But this is where, again, we have to ask ourselves the question, when we look at this, when we see this, are we discovering something about reality? Or when we call this whatever I am, when we call this thing a man, am I making up something about reality? Am I inventing reality? Am I just defining that just as arbitrarily as I could, again, drive on the left side of the road or the right side of the road? Does that make sense? And when I see this, is this something, and when I call that thing, whatever, let's say one of you, when I call one of you this, is that arbitrary? Just like driving on the left side of the road or driving on the right side of the road. Or am I saying something that's true about reality? If this is true, if nominalism is true, it's the second option. Only a useful fiction thing as this in reality, in the same sense that there's no such thing as which side of the road you ought to drive on. Useful fiction. I'm making it up. I'm inventing that. Call this one this, right? Call this one this, right? Such thing as a nature or essence. Now, if this is false, like views here, we may get into those, we may not, but let's just say, for the sake of argument, and there are natures and essences to things, meaning that it's something I see or recognize about reality. This. Is this? No, there's a real distinction between the two. See, we think that none of this stuff matters, but now, because you can turn on the television and look and see what's going on in culture, all of these ideas are at play right now. You just didn't know that these were philosophical ideas, and that what you're seeing right now is the result of philosophical ideas that have made their way into the culture. Does that make sense? You see what I'm saying? So when I have this conversation, it might look different than the way you might have this conversation, or people. So for instance, like when I see someone and I'm talking to someone, and they say, let's just say we say something like, "Hey, Mr. So-and-so," and they say, "Oh, I'm not a Mr., I'm a Mrs." Well, some people might have the conversation like, "Well, what do you mean? Like, I don't, no, you're not, you're this." And say, "Oh, well, who are you to say what I am?" Right, something like that. So if you're not free to say what I am, I'm allowed to define what I am. Well, so I might have the conversation like this. I would say something like, "Well, wait a minute, aren't you assuming that there's no such thing as a nature and essence? Aren't you assuming nominalism? And if you're assuming nominalism, why ought I believe something like nominalism? Why should I believe that? Because what you're telling me is there's no nature or essence to a thing." Right? So then we would have to end up getting in a conversation about this. Now the problem is, and you could have a good conversation about this, a good argument, back and forth, a good debate about this. Now the problem is that, remember Aristotle, what do we call him at the beginning of the semester? Something like the philosopher of common sense, right? Meaning that he wanted to say, no, you can know things, but if you want to play the intellectual game, or not the game, but if you want to play the intellectual, fighting match, so to speak, I'll match wits with you, right? But at the end of the day, he's arguing largely, not to oversimplify here, but largely for a common sense view in a lot of ways, right? And so the one guy goes on the street and says, "Hey, Mr. So-and-so," and then they say, "No, I'm Mrs. So-and-so," and they're just like, "What?" When they say, "Well, who are you to say that I'm a this or a that," or whatever the case may be, the quote unquote normal guy can't make any argument. He's just shocked, right? So this person comes across as more intelligent, right? But what if they're challenged? What if they say, "Well, why should I accept nominalism? Because your view espouses nominalism. I don't know why I should accept that. Give me an argument as to why." Now they look just as what? Right? They look just as ignorant as the guy who's usually supposed to be the ignorant guy, right? Because they're both, the common sense guy is just taking what for granted? That you can know things about reality for granted, right? He's taking that for granted. The common sense guy, we'll put this, the common sense guy takes for granted that you can know things about reality. Takes it for granted. Is taking it for granted that this is true. This guy can't, he thinks you can know something about reality, but takes it for granted, right? This person thinks nominalism is true, but what? They're taking that for granted. Challenge, well, why do you think that you can know something about reality? Especially because that's what the argument would boil down to. Why do you think that you can know that I'm this and not that, right? Because he's saying that he can know something about reality. Well, he can't give an argument for it, right? One, because he intuitively thinks it's just that obvious that he shouldn't have to, but now that he's challenged to give an argument, he doesn't know how, right? But when this person is challenged to give an argument for nominalism, let's say this guy has, let's say he paid attention in school for a minute. Wait a minute, your view assumes nominalism. Nominalism. Well, now this person looks flat-footed as well because they've taken this position for granted. Does that make sense what I'm saying here? Again, right now, I'm not necessarily saying that any is either more intelligent than the other. That's completely not the point. The point is just that both of these sides, to a large degree, especially now, are taking their particular position for granted, right? Does that make sense? They don't know how to argue for their position. Now, in interest of full disclosure, I don't think this person should have to argue for their position all the time. Chesterton said it one time when a guy runs up to him out of the blue and says, "Hey, why is civilization so great? Why should I believe in civilization? Why is this a good idea?" And the guy's like, looks around and sees like, a police, and he looks up, he sees a stoplight, and he sees like, a market where you can buy. And so he's like, it's just one of those things that's so obvious, I don't even know how to make an argument for it. So he's just kind of like looking around at everything that kind of would seem to prove why civilization is, at least as a whole, on the whole, a good thing. All of a sudden, just one day, having to argue something that seems to be, quote unquote, common sense. Now, is that to say that what you think, say common sense is always the right view? No, that's not to say that. It's just to say that there are things about reality that you can know. So, having said all of that, you can see why the nominalist completely rejects what? Which ethical theory that we talked about? Natural law theory, right? Why would the nominalist reject natural law theory? Why would the nominalist reject natural law theory?
Natural law theory, like it says that some things are concrete, I guess.
Well, because there's no such thing as natures and essences, right? And this is what you'll listen to on the thing. It's like, if there's no such thing as natures and essences, then natural law theory just isn't true. Does that make sense? So when you look at natural law theory, and you wonder why, and you come to see that it's fallen on hard times, you have to see why it's fallen on hard times. Why? And I just told you, why has it fallen on hard times? Because what? Because what? Because nominalism is what? The prevailing view right now, right? Does that make sense? Again, so let me say it again, and you tell me, if nominalism is, why would a nominalist reject natural law theory? Right. And so if there's no nature or essence, then what? Right. Why? Because it what? What does natural law theory depend on? Right. There being a nature or essence to a thing. Right. Now, one of the problems, I think among a myriad of others, but I think one of the problems with denying natures and essences, and again, this is, I don't want to get too adept here because I want you to be able to follow what I'm trying to say, is that one of the problems with denying that there are natures and essences to things, and if they're completely arbitrary, then how do we account for the real differences between the two things? Does that make sense? So if this is this, so if there's no essential difference between this and this, literally, let's say these are equal. Like we'll literally put an equal sign there as an equation. Man, equals this. If there's no essential difference here, then at least in theory, I should be able to plug this in to any equation and get the same result. Does that make sense? At least in theory. What am I saying there?
Like they're exactly the same in a way. That like a man gave birth to a child.
Right. So if I make this equation, Chid. Congratulations on your chid. If I make this equation, this plus this equals this, and there's no difference between this and this, then what can I do? Right, then I can say, at least in principle.
Well, actually, there's a lot of stuff going on right now.
I should be able to plug this in principle and get this, right? But I can't do that. Why? Well, it seems like there must be some essential difference, an essence, remember, essential difference between these two things, right? It seems like there must be some essential difference there. Because you might say well, no, it's a biological difference. Well, why is there any, again, if there's no nature and essence to the thing, why is there any difference between a biological difference and a biological difference? Does that make sense? Because even when you say biological, that's what's called a universal. Because what this all boils down to is what's called the problem of the universals. This is an age-old philosophical problem. From the time of Plato, Aristotle, all those guys, this isn't a new debate, whether or not this thing, this nature, this essence, this thing called a nature or essence exists. And so again, we touched on this Monday, one of the problems was, how do we make sense of universal means one in the many, right? So the problem is supposed to be one in the many. One in the many. That's how we roughly get university. It's supposed to make sense of or bring together all of the things under one banner. So remember we talked about, why are all these chairs the same? Why are they all exactly the same? Yet why are they different? So we've got something that seems to be one, like this category of chairs, right? There's one, but there's many of them. How do we make sense of this? So the solution to that, according to Plato had what was called an extreme kind of realism. Aristotle had and then the other extreme view is nominalism, that there's no such thing as natures and essences or whatever. And Aristotle had the middle ground of what's called moderate realism that tries to split the two extremes. So what was the way, according to the people that believed in universals, natures, and essences, what was the way they solved the problem of universals? What was their answer to that? Remember that there's a nature or an essence to the thing, right? They all share what? All of these have in common what? The same what? Nature, right? The same essence. So if there's a bunch of humans in a room, they all share what? Humanness, right? That's what makes them the same, right? That's the one, so to speak, the humanness of each thing in the room. Yet what makes them different? You're not made of the same material she's made of, right? So there's a difference there, but you're also the same. You're the same, but you're different. Now, along, and say you have two flowers that look roughly the same. Let's say they do look the same. Let's say you have a daisy and they're both red or whatever. Now, what do they have in common? I'm just asking you. You don't even try to have to answer philosophically right now. Huh? What do they have in common? Two red flowers sitting there side by side. What do they have in common? Would you say they have redness in common? Is that something? Is that something they have in common to say the redness? Who agrees that they all have redness in common between the two flowers? And they really are both. This isn't a trick question. Red flower, red flower. Would you say they have redness in common with one another? Like, look at her Chick-fil-A bag right now. See the red on the cup and the red on the bag. Do those two things have redness in common with one another? Thank you, Vanna. Do they have redness in common with one another? Raise your hand if you think that. I mean, it's not a trick question. This is just an honest question. Nominalism says no, they don't. They don't have redness in common. Why? Why? See why every person naturally by yourself you're a moderate realist. You believe in natures and essences until you go somewhere and you get educated enough to be taught they don't exist. That's just what I'm saying about common sense. Like Aristotle would say, yeah, they have redness in common. And the common guy who can't give you an argument is justified in saying that they have redness in common. But if you want to come sit at, they'll see them and learn arguments as to why you think that, then come over here, right? Because essentially, sometimes it's said this way. Everybody's a moderate realist until they get a college degree. And the way that I know that you're not a moderate realist or something like that is because if your sentences are grammatically correct and you talk intelligently, but you deny something like that, I know that you're college educated, because nobody believes that without having a degree. Does that make sense? So right now, look at that. Do they have redness in common? No. If you're nominalism, no. That is the prevailing view right now, is that they don't share redness. There's a red thing and there's a red thing, but there's no such thing as redness between them that they have in common. They don't have anything in common in that sense. They don't share redness there.
This like the argument.
Because redness is what? Real quick, what is redness? Redness is the nature, the essence, right? That's the formal cause of red, is redness. Now the question is, does that exist? Does redness exist? And if it exists, if redness exists, then nominalism can't be true. On the other hand, if redness doesn't exist, if there's no such thing as redness, then there's no such thing as, and if that's true across the board, then there's no such thing as a nature or essence or anything else like that. So they literally don't have any one thing in common. They don't share redness. Do colors completely depend on the light spectrum? Like, the colors completely 100% depend upon the light spectrum. Huh?
Like how much of things reflects.
Right. Can there be any color without light? That's false. Easy, bro. Now, I'm being honest here. Interest, full disclosure, I'm in the minority here. Why? Because I think there's such thing as natures and essences. And I'm going to try to show you right now that I think something like physicalism in that sense is false. Because if physicalism is true, then something like light something like redness or color depends 100% on light, right? Because it just is physical. Right now, I want you to imagine when you were a child and you imagine your mom doing the dishes, right? Or let's say, if you can't pull that up, imagine right now you're a little kid in one of your grade rooms in elementary school and you're saying the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. What color were the bars on the flag in your mind's eye? Were they red and white? Did you see redness in your mind? Can you see that? Where's the light? Can you do that if you go to the center of the earth, close your eyes and darkness surrounds you, can you think of the American flag? Can you see that in your mind's eye? Where is that redness? Is it in your head? No, it's in your mind.
My mind is in my head.
Your mind is in your head?
Yeah.
All right, so where is it? Can I touch it?
I mean, if you open it up.
I can touch your mind?
I think so.
Well, then you're a physicalist. Then you don't have a mind, you have a brain.
Well, same thing.
Nuh-uh. If you're a physicalist, the mind is the same thing as the brain. If you're not a physicalist, the mind works in conjunction with the brain.
He wants to reform the body.
So you're saying that my brain is just the thing and the mind is like within my brain?
Your mind is what works in conjunction with your brain. Does that make
So
sense?
does my brain do anything without a mind?
No, I would say no. Well, unless it's like just basic raw instinct, like say breathing, something like that. But even there, Aristotle would say once you die, the formal cause, if you're dead, if you look and you see a dead human, he would say the nature of the thing is gone. There's no that's why it's not even really quote unquote a human anymore. There's no formal cause to the thing. So think about this. If you're thinking of that flag in your head, you're the middle of the earth, complete utter darkness. Can I cut open your brain and see redness? Then it's not in there. It's in your mind. What's the thought? Is the thought real? Why is this important? It sounds crazy, but why is it important? Because if that's real, physicalism is false. If a thought, say the thought, your redness, if you're thinking of the American flag or whatever, the Russian flag with the yellow, sickle and star or whatever it is, hammer and sickle, if you're thinking of that and you see that yellowness, you see the redness of that, and there's no light anywhere whatsoever that can be causing that, then that can't be dependent completely on light, right? Which means it can't be physical. Meaning that if I cut your head open, I can never even in principle see a little American flag somewhere in your head. I can see the neurochemical reactions, all those sorts of things, but I can't see the thought. Does that make sense? I can't see it. But if physicalism is true and everything is describable in terms of atoms and molecules and conglomerations of physical parts, then in principle, I should be able to see whatever exists, given the right equipment, microscopes, whatever the case may be. But if whenever you think of an American flag in your mind, does a little American flag pop up somewhere in your head? No, I mean in a physical sense. It would have to. If physicalism is true, there'd have to be a tiny little physical flag somewhere in your mind, right? In your quote unquote brain. I should have said that wrongly. It would be in your brain somewhere. In your brain. But if I can see redness, a nature or an essence, which would be a nature or an essence, if I can see that, then there has to be something that exists, namely at least that redness, that's not physical. Does that make sense? Like, this is something I've tried to talk to my wife about 100 times and she just doesn't get it.
So are you saying redness can't exist? Or are you saying?
No, I'm saying redness does exist. Those things have redness in common.
But I can't have redness in my brain?
Not in your brain, in your mind. You can have it in your mind. Like you can see redness in your mind. You can close your eyes, you can see redness. There's a subjectivity to it. So atheist philosopher Thomas Nagel says this. He says there's a article that he's written called What It's Like to Be a Bat. And so this is supposed to be funny, right? So he talks about how in principle there's a subjectiveness about what it would be like to be a bat. And he says, you in principle can never know what it would be like to be a bat. Why? Well, and not even that you've never been it, because you can't even experience it. So they're like, well, yeah, I could somehow hook up some equipment where I could learn to do sonar radar. Maybe I could fly around, whatever. He's like, no, you would just know what it's like for you to use sonar radar, what it's like for you to fly around, but you couldn't know what it's like to be literally a bat, because there's a subjectivity to it that literally can never be touched, can't be gotten at. It can't be right unless you are that thing. But if everything is physical, if everything that exists is just physical, then in principle you should be able to, at least in principle, know what it's like to be that. But there's a subjectivity about it that can't be quote unquote gotten. Does that make sense? Just like, so this parallels when you think of redness or the American flag when you're saying the pledge when you're a kid and you see those colors. If physicalism is true, at least in principle, I should be able to get to that knowledge or that piece of reality, right? Does that make sense? Because that's real. It's not, when you picture the American flag, you're saying the pledge when you're a little kid and you see this redness, the blueness, whatever's there. You see that there. Is that real or not real? That image, you're seeing it, the redness or whatever. Is that real or not real? It has to be real. If it's not real, then what are you seeing? Right? You can't see not real things. Right? in the sense of this concept or whatever. But if you're seeing that, then where is that? Is it spatial? Because remember, if it's physical, then necessarily it has to be what? It has to be spatial, it has to extend in space somewhere, right? Because it's physical. It has to be bound by time in some sense, right? Because space, time, and matter are correlative for Einstein. But where is it? And what is it? Is it real? If that's true, then physicalism can't be true. But that's just what we mean to say when we talk about natures and essences and whatever. And again, I'm being completely honest. Like most philosophers right now would not agree with me. They would want to argue that no, those aren't real. But in all honesty, I just can't see a good argument that shows that they're not. So right now, one of the middle grounds is they try to say, well, it's supervenient upon. Say something like that redness that you see in your mind, that's supervenient upon or dovetails upon physical reality, meaning that it's kind of like a tree in a shadow. So even though the shadow's there, it's completely dependent upon the tree that casts it, right? The tree being physical. Does that make sense? You following me? So like right now, I don't know where the light is for you guys, but this shadow, if you can see it on the board of my hand, this shadow is 100% completely dependent upon the physical, right? But the minute this is gone, then that's gone too. One, I don't think that analogy works at all because what are shadows? Right, they're the absence of something, right? And a shadow is not the same. It doesn't have a positive ontological status like a thought does. Like when you see redness, a shadow is the absence or the negation of something, right? It's completely disanalogous, I think, to say that a thought, or when you close your eyes and you picture redness in the middle of your bedroom at night at 3 in the morning when it's completely pitch black. What does it mean to say that that's like a shadow when a shadow is not there, right? Because what is a shadow? A shadow is just blocking of some light, right? So a shadow is not there in that sense. And so this is what would be something called emergent properties. Philosophers would say it's called an emergent property, like mind or consciousness is something like an emergent property that's dependent upon the physical. Now, some philosophers don't buy that. They think that gives too much ground to what? They think that's letting a foot in the door of what? No, they think that's letting a foot in the door that there are things that really do exist that aren't physical. So then you have some philosophers that are going the other way, the other extreme, and they're saying what? That there's literally no such thing as consciousness. There's no such thing as quote unquote free will, any of those things. They're all illusory. That's all an illusion. I don't see how that's not just self-defeating though. Again, based off, say, first principles. Law of non-contradiction, law of excluded middle, law of identity. So that's why, again, you've got atheist agnostic philosopher David Chalmers, philosopher of mind, that is saying right now, like one of the most preeminent philosophers of our century, especially in regards to philosophy of mind, David Chalmers, is saying, and Thomas Nagel at NYU, one of the most preeminent philosophical schools in the world, not just our country, but in the world, Thomas Nagel and David Chalmers saying, physicalism is failing to account for what we know about reality. There has to be some other way to get around it. It's called the hard problem of consciousness. Physicalism, they're saying, is failing to explain reality as we know it. So, again, I'm being completely honest. I'm in the minority here on this in the philosophical community right now. Now, I wasn't in the minority up until the Enlightenment, but I'm in the minority now in regards to it. But I just don't think that you can get around natures and essences existing. One, again, because what we did up there, this little equation, at least in principle, if there's no essential difference, then you should be able to plug in and have the same results if there's literally no difference. Because you can't say there's even a biological difference, because biological just is another universal term, right? That's just another abstracted category, which either exists or doesn't exist. Biology either exists as a universal or doesn't exist as a universal. Does that make sense? No, I know it doesn't make sense, but I'm just telling it to you anyway. So one time Chesterton said it like this. He's having a debate with either H.G. Wells or what's his name? George Bernard Shaw. And so George Bernard Shaw is saying something like nominalism. And he says, look, man, all chairs are different. And Chesterton says, well, they can't be all that different if they're all chairs. Does that make sense? Right. Chesterton was known for his wit, super funny guy. But the argument there was essentially Chesterton is saying they all share what? Chairness, right? He said you can't call them all chairs if they're not all chairs, right? If they're all as different as you say they are, then it's really hard to see how you can call them all chairs. This is also like, Wittgenstein, depending on what area of the country you're in, how you're going to pronounce his name, who says that all of this is language games. And then he goes in to say that we can't even nail down if there's such thing as a nature and essence to a game. We can't even nail down what it is because he can go through all of these games that are completely different. They don't share one particular thing in common. So how can there be a nature of a game? Well, the problem is what? Well, then how can you call them all games if none of them are games or none of them are the same? You see what I'm saying? Like, you're constantly having to appeal to universals or natures and essences in order to try to argue against universals and natures and essences. So Peter Kreeft likes to say it this way. One guy says, he talks about all trees. He says, no, trees there's no such thing as treeness. Trees have treeness in common. There's nothing in common there. They just share things like trunks, leaves, bark. Well, those themselves are just more what? Natures and essences. Because you can't say they share bark in common, because bark just is what? Sure, right. Or barkness. You can't say they share bark in common because you're just saying they share barkness. You can't say they have trunks in common because you're just saying they both have trunkness. You can't argue against it without using more natures and essences. Does that make sense? And see, these guys would argue that all this results down to or flows down into first principles. That's how they would try to argue that all these things you're constantly going to have to appeal to, you're going to have to violate some sort of first principle in order to try to make your argument. That's what they would say. That's what even I might argue at that point. Now, let's ramrod through virtue theory so we don't have to do it later. Back to our ethical theories. We've got 10 minutes, so you'll get a completely terrible overview of virtue theory, but at least this way we can get through it. Virtue theory, what is virtue theory? What is it? Is it an ethical theory? Yes, ethical theory, right? Now, what is the stark difference between virtue theory and every other system we've talked about so far? Remember, you're supposed to have already read all these. What is the main difference between virtue theory and every ethical theory we've talked about?
Is the one that's not prescriptive?
No, it's prescriptive. Only the quote-unquote ethical theory that's not prescriptive. It's just descriptive, right? All these others are supposed to tell you how you ought to behave, right? Now, virtue theory is different. How? Because every ethical theory we've talked about up to this point concentrates on what? What you do in a given situation, right? Your duty or the principles that you're supposed to act on, the way you're supposed to behave in this certain circumstance X, right? Now, virtue theory is what? This is probably one of the most familiar theories you've grown up with your entire life. Well, I'd say all of them you've grown up with. This one also. You just didn't know that it was called virtue theory. How many of your moms and dads want you to be a certain kind of person? They want you to grow up to be this kind of person. That's virtue theory. Virtue theory is not so much concerned with the rule that you follow at that moment in time. Virtue theory stresses what? Becoming something. That you literally turn into something, some kind of thing with what? How would we normally categorize that? Character, right? That you develop what? Character. To develop character, but to turn into a certain type of thing just is virtue theory. It means that you become a what kind of person? Virtuous person, that you turn into this thing, that you become this sort of thing. So you remember when we were talking about Kant, and we said that, his whole thing was about duty. You do things out of duty. And remember, he would say the guy that did this for this duty, or for the purposes of duty, did better than the guy who did it because he liked it. Remember that? Here he says, wait a minute. They say, why can't you become the kind of person that wants to do the right thing? Now, I think that we can at least say one of the appeals right off the bat would be what? Would you rather be the kind of person that lives a quote-unquote moral life by the other systems, but you didn't enjoy any of it, or the kind of person that lives a moral life and you actually enjoy quote-unquote doing the right thing? Does that make sense? You would be that kind of, that's what the Greeks, the ancient Greeks and virtue theorists, modern virtue theorists now would say is the end goal of ethics, is to turn you into, to become a person of virtue or a person of character. In fact, there's a very, 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 very unbelievably popular, at least it was in my day when I was in my early 20s, everybody had one of these. And it's a virtue theory ethic. What was it? Does anybody remember? There's a little bracelet. What was the little bracelet? Everybody used to wear it walking around all the time. Yep. The little WWJD bracelets. That is virtue theory. How? How?
Like trying to exemplify his character. Like you're trying to be like.
Right. Right. So virtue theory says one of the things is you recognize a virtuous person. Then you what? Emulate that. Does that make sense? If everybody's walking around with a WWJD bracelet, they're essentially telling themselves what? What would the virtuous man do in this situation? And they've identified, in this case, Jesus as what? The virtuous man. And they asked themselves, or at least in principle, they were supposed to ask themselves, what would he do in this situation, right? Then if you do that, then you emulate what? That type of behavior, which turns you into, over time, what? That kind of thing, right? That kind of character. Now, this may be, surprising to you, but virtue theory is one of the big three ethical theories now. So you've got constant ontology, utilitarianism, and virtue theory that's still quote unquote in the game, so to speak, even in major philosophical schools that all disagree with one another. That's still one of the ones that's in the game, so to speak, as far as an ethical theory. It's virtue theory. One of the problems with virtue theory, and I want you guys to look at this more if you want, because we're having it, we're not, sad to say we're not really given the time that it deserves, is that how do you determine what is virtuous? How might you determine that? Aristotle's method was called the golden mean, right? What is the golden mean? What's the golden mean? Can you even guess just by looking at that?
And is it like the golden rule?
No.
Like the middle ground.
Right. The golden mean, roughly, and again, I'm not doing justice to this at all, so I apologize for that.
It's
But
like walking that fine line between good and being good and what's supposed to be bad.
well, let me just say this: the golden mean is moderation, right? So this is the good thing right here. So something like cowardice is one extreme. Something like, on the other end, would be something like foolhardiness. Would be the other extreme. Like, hey man, hold my beer, watch this. Well, Aristotle would be like, well, that's obviously not. So the middle ground would be what? A proper sense of what? Courage, right? Or bravery, something like that. Because the guy who says, hold my beer, watch this, and jumps off the 70-foot cliff, is he courageous or brave? Right, who says that's just foolhardiness. It's not brave. You're not brave because you don't have courage because you jump off the bridge. Now the other guy over here, when some difficult situation arises and he doesn't do it because he's not, he doesn't exemplify courage or whatever. He's the other extreme. He's a coward, right? So Aristotle says the middle ground here. And this would be how you, at least in theory, you would go down that road, that track, so to speak, and that's how you would find out what the virtuous choice would be in that matter. No, well, I don't want to say virtuous choice per se, but that's how you decide what the virtue is. Does that make sense? At least in that. Now, you had some people, one of the first problems with this is that you had some people that immediately came by, or not immediately, but would come along later, even though they were devoted to, say, Aristotelianism, and they said there's some problems here. For instance, Aquinas would say this. Say for a human being, something like love would be one extreme, and just absolute total maliciousness on the other. What's the middle ground here? Let's say a philosopher like Aquinas. What's the middle ground here? Right, that would be one of these others up here about, greed and, just giving everything away. Aquinas says, wait a minute, this isn't an extreme. Extreme, but what? He said, you ought to go this way. Now, he still held on, for what it's worth, for the most part, this kind of thing here. But he would just say, wait a minute, some of these have to be looked at. Like specifically, his example would be like love for God, something like that. You can't, there's no middle ground between, say, hating God or something and loving God with everything you are. You ought to love, he would say something like that, right? So, but that's also true in regards to other things, like say, you can't be extreme in your pursuit of justice, something like that, like Cicero says something like this. You may be able to reformulate that and say, well, wait a minute, no one's saying that you should be extreme in your pursuit of justice, because justice just would be the middle ground between, say, two extremes of some sort, right? Say that might be a response to something like that. But so anyway, at least what I wanted you to take away from, and we may talk a little bit about this because you guys have class Tuesday, right? You don't have class Wednesday, right? In that last day. So we'll probably just wrap up some of this stuff just because, we don't have class. We'll probably just kind of just wrap up some of this and then maybe we'll do some kind of like free Q&A time or something on Tuesday, just to kind of keep it light since it's Thanksgiving break or whatever. And then we'll probably wrap up the rest of this. But at least what you can take today while you leave is that for the most part, virtue theory is focused on becoming a certain kind of person, right? Not just say the rules of what it means to do what's right in circumstance X. It means that you're supposed to turn into this thing. And then we'll go ahead and talk a little more about the objections to virtue theory. Our next class, we'll talk about some of the objections to that. Peace out.